The morning mist clung to the hills south of Seoul like a funeral shroud as Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smith watched his men dig frantically into the rocky Korean soil. It was July 5, 1950, and the world seemed to be ending around them. Behind him, the remnants of the South Korean army streamed southward in chaotic retreat, their faces etched with the terror of men who had witnessed the unstoppable advance of the North Korean People's Army. Smith's task force, SMITHA, hastily assembled unit of 406 American soldiers from the 24th Infantry Division represented the first commitment of United States ground forces to the Korean conflict. They had been rushed from comfortable garrison duty in Japan, with promises that their mere presence would halt the communist advance. Now, as Smith surveyed the approaching columns of North Korean T-34 tanks through his binoculars, he understood the terrible naivety of that assumption. The thunder of tank treads grew louder, accompanied by the distinctive whine of diesel engines pushed to their limits. The North Koreans had swept through Seoul in just 3 days, their Soviet-built armor crushing all resistance. Behind the tanks came waves of infantry, battle-hardened veterans of the Chinese Civil War, who moved with the confidence of men accustomed to victory. "Sir, they're coming straight at us," Sergeant First Class Robert Schaefer whispered, his voice barely audible above the growing mechanical roar. The young soldier's hands trembled as he checked his rifle for the 100th time that morning. Smith nodded grimly. His small force possessed only 2 outdated anti-tank guns and a handful of ineffective bazooka rockets. Intelligence had assured them that the North Korean army was poorly equipped, another catastrophic miscalculation that would cost American lives within the hour. The first T-34 crested the hill at exactly 11:30 that morning, its gun turret swiveling toward the American positions like a predator sensing prey. Smith gave the order to fire, and the morning air erupted with the crack of rifles and the whoosh of rocket-propelled grenades. The anti-tank rounds bounced harmlessly off the Soviet armor, their impact barely scratching the tank's thick steel hide. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. The North Korean tanks rolled through the American positions like iron juggernauts, their machine guns chattering death, while their main guns demolished hastily constructed foxholes. Smith watched in horror as his men were cut down, their bodies twisted into unnatural positions by the fury of modern warfare. Within hours, Task Force Smith had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Smith himself was captured, becoming one of the first American prisoners of war in Korea. The survivors who managed to escape carried with them the terrible news that would soon reach General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo. American ground forces were no match for the North Korean war machine. As word of the disaster spread through the Pentagon, military planners faced a chilling reality. The entire Korean peninsula might fall within weeks, creating a communist stronghold that would threaten Japan and fundamentally alter the balance of power in East Asia. The domino theory, which had seemed like mere political rhetoric, was becoming horrifyingly real before their eyes. General Walton Walker pressed his weathered face against the window of his command aircraft as it circled above the smoking ruins of Taijan. Below him, the roads were clogged with refugees and retreating soldiers, a human river flowing southward toward the port city of Pusan. It was July 20th, 1950, and Walker had just received command of the newly formed 8th Army. In Korea, a force that existed more on paper than in reality, the situation reports that cluttered his makeshift desk painted a picture of unmitigated disaster. The 24th Infantry Division, rushed from Japan in piecemeal fashion, had been systematically destroyed in a series of delaying actions. The 25th Infantry Division had fared little better, losing entire battalions to the relentless North Korean advance. Most shocking of all, the proud 1st Cavalry Division, though they had traded their horses for tanks, decades earlier had been mauled so badly that some regiments could barely muster company strength. Walker understood that he was not commanding. an army but supervising a retreat. His forces were scattered across hundreds of miles, often out of communication with higher headquarters, fighting desperate rearguard actions against an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited reserves of men and equipment. The North Korean advance had achieved a momentum that appeared unstoppable. According to military historians from the Army War College, as documented in their comprehensive study, The Korean War, First Year, Walker faced the most challenging command situation in American military history. He had to simultaneously rebuild his shattered units while conducting a fighting withdrawal across unfamiliar terrain against a numerically superior enemy. The geography of southern Korea offered Walker one final defensive option, the Pusan perimeter. This natural fortress was bounded by the Naktong River to the west and north, mountains to the north and east, and the Korea Strait to the south. The port of Pusan itself provided the only means of supply and reinforcement from Japan. If this line could not be held, the entire American commitment to Korea would end in humiliating evacuation. Walker's chief of staff, Brigadier General Eugene Landrum, spread a battle-worn map across the general's field table. "Sir, we're establishing defensive positions here, and here," he said, pointing to key terrain features along the proposed perimeter. "The line will stretch approximately 90 miles, defended by what's left of 3 divisions plus our OK forces. How many effective soldiers do we actually have?" Walker asked, dreading the answer. "Perhaps 40,000 Americans fit for combat duty, sir. The Republic of Korea forces add another 50,000, but their reliability remains questionable after the Seoul collapse." Walker studied the map in silence. 90 miles of front held by 90,000 men, many of them green troops who had never seen combat before arriving in Korea, against an enemy force estimated at nearly twice that number. Military doctrine called for a 3-to-1 advantage when attacking prepared positions, yet here the defenders would be outnumbered 2-to-1. The telephone beside Walker's elbow rang with the harsh jangle that had become the soundtrack of retreat. His aide answered, then handed him the receiver with a grim expression. "General MacArthur, sir." MacArthur's voice crackled across the static-filled connection from his headquarters in Tokyo. "Walker, I'm sending you the 2nd Infantry Division and the 1st Marine Brigade. They'll arrive within 10 days. Can you hold until then?" Walker glanced at the map, then at the intelligence reports describing the North Korean buildup across the Naktong River. "We'll hold, sir. We have no choice." As he replaced the receiver, Walker wondered if he had just made a promise that would prove impossible to keep. The morning of August 1st, 1950, dawned clear and hot over the Naktong River, where Private First Class Jimmy Martinez crouched in a hastily dug foxhole, watching the opposite bank through eyes red with exhaustion. The 27th Infantry Regiment had been holding this section of the Pusan perimeter for 6 days, and Martinez had not slept for more than 2 hours at a stretch during that entire time. Across the muddy waters of the Naktong, he could see North Korean soldiers moving through the rice paddies like ants preparing for war. Their olive-green uniforms blended seamlessly with the vegetation, making them nearly invisible until they moved. Intelligence reports suggested that 3 full divisions of the North Korean People's Army were massing for what would surely be the decisive assault on the perimeter. "Martinez, you awake over there?" The voice belonged to Corporal Billy Thompson, a farm boy from Iowa whose easy grin had disappeared somewhere between Taishan and this godforsaken river line. "Hard to sleep with all that activity across the river," Martinez replied, adjusting his grip on his May 1 rifle. The weapon felt impossibly heavy after days of constant vigilance, but it remained his most faithful companion in this hellish landscape. Behind them, the sounds of preparation echoed across the hills. Artillery crews worked frantically to dig their 105mm howitzers deeper into the Korean soil, while engineers strung additional barbed wire and laid anti-personnel mines. along likely avenues of approach. Every soldier understood that this was their final stand. There would be no further retreat. Colonel John Michaelis, commander of the 27th Infantry Regiment, moved among his men with the calm confidence that had earned him their respect. During the dark days of July, despite the overwhelming odds, Michaelis had transformed his battered unit into an effective fighting force through a combination of harsh discipline and genuine concern for his soldiers' welfare. "Listen up, men," Michaelis addressed a group of squad leaders gathered around his command post. "Intelligence indicates the North Koreans will attempt a major crossing tonight. They'll probably hit us with artillery first, then try to establish a bridgehead under cover of darkness." The young faces that stared back at him bore little resemblance to the confident soldiers who had left Japan just weeks earlier. Combat had aged them decades in a matter of days, etching lines of exhaustion and determination around their eyes. Yet something had hardened in these men during their ordeal, a resolve that had been absent during the early disasters at Pusan and Taijan. Sergeant Robert Roy, a World War II veteran whose Bronze Star testified to his courage at Normandy, raised his hand. "Sir, what about ammunition resupply?" "We're running low on everything, especially anti-tank rounds," Michaelis nodded grimly. The logistics situation remained precarious, with supplies arriving by airlift when weather permitted and by convoy when the roads remained open. "Division promises a supply drop tonight, weather permitting. Until then, make every shot count." As darkness fell over the Naktong, the first North Korean artillery shells began falling on American positions. The barrage continued for 2 hours, a relentless hammering that tested the nerves of even the most experienced soldiers. Tree branches showered down like deadly rain, while shrapnel whined through the air with the sound of angry hornets. Martinez pressed himself deeper into his foxhole as explosions erupted around him. Somewhere to his left, he heard a scream that was quickly cut short. The acrid smell of cordite mixed with the earthy scent of torn soil, creating an odor that would haunt his dreams for decades to come. Through the chaos of the bombardment, Martinez began to hear a new sound, the splash of men moving through water. The North Koreans were crossing the Naktong under cover of their own artillery fire, exactly as Colonel Michaelis had predicted. "Here they come." Thompson's voice cut through the noise of exploding shells. "Wait for the flares." The night sky suddenly blazed with artificial daylight as American illumination rounds burst overhead. In their harsh glare, Martinez could see hundreds of North Korean soldiers wading across the river, their weapons held high above their heads. Behind them came small boats and makeshift rafts carrying heavier equipment. "Fire!" the command echoed. Up and down the American line, and the night erupted with the staccato rhythm of small arms fire. Captain Lewis Millett adjusted his steel helmet and peered through the pre-dawn darkness toward the Naktong River, where the sounds of combat had raged throughout the night. His easy company of the 27th Infantry Regiment occupied a crucial section of the perimeter where intelligence indicated the North Koreans had successfully established a bridgehead. During their nighttime assault, the reports filtering back from forward observers painted a grim picture. Despite the valiant efforts of American forces, elements of the 4th North Korean People's Army Division had managed to cross the river in significant numbers. They had dug into the hills overlooking the American positions, creating a salient that threatened to split the entire defensive line. "Sir, regiment wants us to counterattack at 0600 hours, reported First Sergeant Michael O'Brien, a grizzled veteran whose Irish accent became more pronounced under stress. "We're to advance with Fox Company on our left and George Company on our right." Millett studied his map by the light of a carefully shielded flashlight. The planned assault would carry his men across 800 yards of open ground against an enemy that had spent the night preparing defensive positions. Military manuals taught that such attacks required overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower, luxuries that Easy Company distinctly lacked. The men of Easy Company had been reduced to barely 90 effective soldiers after 3 weeks of continuous combat. Their uniforms were torn and filthy, their faces gaunt from irregular meals and constant stress. Yet something indefinable had emerged from their shared ordeal, brotherhood forged in the crucible of desperate battle. Private Eugene Obregon checked his Browning automatic rifle for the final time, ensuring that each 20-round magazine was properly seated. The bar represented the squad's primary source of firepower, and Obregon had earned a reputation for deadly accuracy during the fighting retreat from Seoul. His steady hands and calm demeanor under fire had saved countless lives during the dark days of July. "Remember, this is it," Millet addressed his assembled platoon leaders. "There's nowhere left to run. If we don't hold this line, the whole perimeter collapses and we're looking at another Dunkirk. But unlike the Brits, we don't have the Royal Navy waiting offshore to pull us out." According to official Army records later compiled by military historians, the battle that followed would become known as the First Battle of the Naktong, bulged the opening engagement in what would prove to be a decisive struggle for the survival of South Korea. At precisely 6 o'clock, American artillery began falling on the North Korean positions across the river. The barrage lasted 15 minutes, sending geysers of earth and smoke skyward while the infantrymen of Easy Company prepared for their assault. When the guns lifted, Millet gave the signal that would send his men into the teeth of enemy fire. "Let's go. Follow me," Millet shouted, rising from his position and advancing toward the North Korean lines. Behind him, 90 American soldiers emerged from their foxholes and began the long walk across the killing ground. The North Koreans had used the night hours well. Their machine gun positions were expertly sited to create interlocking fields of fire, while mortar crews had pre-registered their weapons on likely avenues of approach. As the Americans advanced across the open ground, enemy fire began to find its mark with devastating effect. Obregon's bar chattered steadily as he provided covering fire for his advancing squad mates. His trained eye picked out muzzle flashes from the North Korean positions, and his return fire was both accurate and deadly. Yet for every enemy soldier silenced, 2 more seemed to take his place. Halfway across the open ground, Millet realized that his assault was failing. Too many of his men had fallen, and the survivors were pinned down by withering enemy fire. The textbook solution would be to order a withdrawal and call for additional artillery support. But textbook solutions had proven inadequate throughout the Korean campaign. Instead, Millet made a decision that would echo through military history. Drawing his pistol, he stood up in full view of the enemy and began walking steadily toward their positions. "Come on, you sons of bitches," he roared above the din of battle. "Do you want to live forever?" His example galvanized the surviving members of Easy Company. One by one, they rose from cover and followed their captain in a desperate charge that transformed near defeat into stunning victory. Colonel John McCullough stood atop Hill 203, surveying the aftermath of the morning's counterattack through binoculars that had seen service from Normandy to the Naktong River. Below him, the bodies of North Korean soldiers dotted the landscape like fallen leaves, testament to the ferocity of Captain Millet's bayonet charge. Yet McCullough understood that this victory, however inspiring, represented merely the first round in what promised to be a prolonged battle for survival. His radio operator, Corporal David Kim, Korean-American from Los Angeles whose language skills had proven invaluable, handed him the handset with an expression of barely controlled urgency. "Sir, General Walker on the line." Walker's voice carried the weight of command decisions that could determine the fate of nations. "John, I need to know your situation. Can you hold your sector?" McCullough glanced at the casualty reports that his adjutant had just delivered. Easy Company had suffered 30% casualties during the morning assault, while Fox and George companies had fared little better. Ammunition reserves were critically low, and medical supplies were nearly exhausted. By every conventional measure, the 27th Infantry Regiment was a spent force. "We'll hold, sir," Michaelis replied without hesitation. "Give us the ammunition and medical supplies, and we'll hold until hell freezes over." The promise was easier made than kept. Throughout the afternoon of August 2nd, North Korean forces continued to probe the American lines, seeking weaknesses that could be exploited for breakthrough assault. Their tactics had evolved since the early days of the war, incorporating lessons learned from their encounters with American firepower and determination. Staff Sergeant William Richardson, commanding what remained of 2nd Platoon, Easy Company, watched enemy movement through the scope of his M1 rifle. The North Koreans were using small unit tactics now, infiltrating through the hills in squad-sized elements rather than launching massed frontal assaults. This new approach made them harder to detect and engage with supporting artillery fire. "Sergeant, I count at least 20 moving through that draw," whispered Private Tommy Chen, pointing toward a fold in the terrain approximately 400 yards to their front. Chun had been a college student at UCLA before the war, studying engineering, with dreams of building bridges and skyscrapers. Now his technical mind focused on calculating range and windage for his rifle shots. Richardson studied the terrain through his binoculars, noting the careful way the North Korean soldiers moved from cover to cover. These were not the green conscripts, who had made up the bulk of enemy forces during the early campaign. These men moved with the confidence of veteran soldiers who understood both the capabilities and limitations of their American opponents. According to declassified intelligence reports later revealed by the Central Intelligence Agency, the North Korean Command had committed their elite Seoul Division to the assault on the Pusan perimeter. These troops represented the cream of the Korean People's Army, battle-tested veterans who had spearheaded the capture of Seoul and the subsequent drive southward. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the American positions, turning steel helmets into ovens and making every movement an ordeal. Water discipline became as important as ammunition conservation, with each soldier rationed to half a canteen per day. The Korean summer showed no mercy to either side in this deadly struggle. Private Martinez, now serving as assistant squad leader, after his sergeant had been evacuated with shrapnel wounds, distributed the last of his unit's rifle ammunition among his remaining men. Each soldier received 20 rounds, barely enough for 10 minutes of sustained combat. The mathematics of warfare had become brutally simple. Make every shot count or face annihilation. As evening approached, the tempo of North Korean attacks intensified. Mortar rounds began falling on American positions with increasing accuracy, suggesting that enemy observers had spent the day plotting precise coordinates for their fire missions. The whine of incoming shells became a constant background noise, punctuated by the sharper crack of small arms fire as infiltrators probed the defensive perimeter. Michaelis moved among his forward positions as darkness fell, checking on his men and ensuring that communication lines remained intact. He found Easy Company's command post in a shallow depression that offered minimal protection from enemy fire, where Captain Millett was coordinating with his remaining platoon leaders. "How are we holding up, Lou?" Michaelis asked, though the answer was written on every face around the improvised command post. "We're down to about 60 effectives, sir," Millett reported. "Ammo situation is critical, and we've got 17 wounded who need evacuation." Michaelis nodded grimly. Similar reports were coming in from every unit along his regimental front. The 27th Infantry Regiment was being bled white in a battle that had no clear end in sight. Yet as he looked at the faces of his officers, young men who had been tested beyond all reasonable limits, Michaelis saw something that military manuals could not quantify. These soldiers had discovered reserves of courage and determination that they had never known they possessed. The pre-dawn hours of August 15th, 1950, brought no relief to the exhausted defenders of the Pusan perimeter. Lieutenant Robert Bartsch of the 2nd Infantry Division's 9th Infantry Regiment crouched in his command post, a hastily excavated bunker that reeked of sweat, cordite, and fear. Around him, the remnants of his rifle company prepared for what intelligence reports suggested would be the largest North Korean assault yet attempted. For 2 weeks, the battle had raged along the Naktong River with an intensity that reminded World War II veterans of the worst fighting in the Pacific Theater. The North Korean People's Army had committed virtually every reserve unit to breaking the American defensive line, understanding that failure here might mean the permanent division of Korea. Bartsch studied the situation map that his company clerk had updated throughout the night. Red arrows marked confirmed enemy positions, while question marks indicated areas where North Korean forces were suspected but not confirmed. The map looked like a medical chart documenting the spread of a lethal disease. Enemy penetrations appeared everywhere along the defensive perimeter. "Sir, radio message from battalion," reported Corporal James Murphy, the company's senior radio operator. His voice carried the flat tone of a man who had delivered too many bad news messages. "Over the past fortnight, the North Koreans have crossed the river in force at 3 separate points. We're to hold our positions at all costs." The phrase, "at all costs," had acquired a specific meaning during the Korean fighting. It meant that no retreat would be authorized, regardless of casualties or tactical situation. For soldiers already pushed beyond the normal limits of human endurance, this order carried the weight of a death sentence. Private First Class Anthony Calabrese checked his MiG-1 rifle for what seemed like the 1,000th time that night. The weapon had become an extension of his body during the endless battles along the perimeter. Its 8-round clip the difference between life and death in countless firefights. Beside him, his foxhole partner Private Roy Washington cleaned his bayonet with methodical precision, preparing for the close-quarters combat that inevitably followed North Korean breakthrough attempts. The two soldiers had little in common beyond their shared ordeal. Calabrese was a barber's son from Brooklyn, while Washington had grown up picking cotton in Mississippi. Yet the crucible of combat had forged a bond between them that transcended racial and regional differences. In the face of an enemy that made no distinction between black and white Americans, such division seemed not just irrelevant, but absurd. As the first gray light of dawn crept across the Korean hills, the North Korean artillery barrage began with unprecedented intensity. Shell after shell crashed into the American positions, each explosion sending tons of earth skyward, while fragments of hot steel whined through the air like deadly wasps. The bombardment continued for 90 minutes, the longest preparation fire that American forces had yet experienced in Korea. Through the chaos of exploding shells, Bartsch could hear his men calling for medics, their voices barely audible above the din of battle. Somewhere to his left, a direct hit on a foxhole had silenced an entire squad, while to his right, screams indicated that another position had taken casualties. The systematic destruction of his company was proceeding with mechanical precision. According to the official history compiled by the Army's Center of Military History, the North Korean assault that followed represented the climactic moment of the Battle of Pusan perimeter. 3 full divisions of the Korean People's Army, supported by T-34 tanks and massive artillery concentrations, launched coordinated attacks along a 20-mile front. When the artillery lifted, the landscape seemed to come alive with enemy soldiers. They emerged from concealed positions like a human tide, their olive-green uniforms blending with the vegetation as they advanced in disciplined waves. At the head of each assault formation, political commissars urged the troops forward with a combination of revolutionary slogans and personal example. "Here they come," Washington shouted, chambering a round in his rifle and taking careful aim at the approaching enemy soldiers. His first shot dropped a North Korean squad leader at 200 yards, while his second found the machine gunner, who had been providing covering fire for the assault. Calabrese worked his rifle with mechanical precision, firing the 8-round clip as rapidly as accuracy allowed before ejecting the empty clip and reloading. The distinctive ping of the M1 rifle became the soundtrack of desperate defense as American soldiers poured fire into the advancing enemy ranks. Yet for every North Korean soldier who fell, 2 more seemed to take his place. The assault waves kept coming with the relentless persistence of ocean breakers, each one carrying them closer to the American defensive line. Barsht realized with growing horror that his company lacked the firepower to stop this human avalanche. The breakthrough came at exactly 0830 hours, when a company of North Korean infantry overran the left flank of the American position. Within minutes, enemy soldiers were fighting hand-to-hand with the defenders, their burp guns chattering in the confined space of the trench system. General Walton Walker stood in the operations center of his 8th Army headquarters, watching with grim satisfaction as red pins on the situation map began to be replaced with blue ones. It was September 15th, 1950, and the miracle that military historians would later call the Great Reversal was unfolding before his eyes. After nearly 2 months of desperate defensive fighting, the tide of battle had finally turned at the Pusan perimeter. The transformation had begun 3 days earlier with the arrival of the 1st Marine Brigade at Pusan Harbor. These battle-tested veterans of World War II brought with them not only fresh manpower but also a level of training and esprit de corps that had been sadly lacking among the hastily deployed Army units. More importantly, they carried with them the close air support techniques that would prove decisive in breaking the North Korean offensive. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Murray, commanding officer of the 5th Marine Regiment, had immediately grasped the tactical situation upon his arrival. At the perimeter, the North Korean forces had committed their reserves to a series of breakthrough attempts, leaving their supply lines dangerously extended and vulnerable to counterattack. Murray proposed a bold plan that would exploit this weakness through coordinated ground and air assault. "Gentlemen, we're going to hit them where they don't expect it," Murray explained to his assembled battalion commanders. The Marine colonel's confidence was infectious, spreading through his command structure like electricity. After weeks of retreat and offensive fighting, his Marines were eager for the opportunity to take the offensive. The counterattack began at dawn on September 13th with a coordinated artillery barrage that dwarfed anything the North Koreans had previously experienced. 150 guns opened fire simultaneously, their shells falling like steel rain on enemy positions across the Naktong River. The psychological effect on North Korean troops was devastating. Many had never experienced such concentrated firepower. Staff Sergeant John Roan led his Marine rifle squad across the contested ground with the steady advance that had characterized Marine operations from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima. Behind him, his 12 Marines moved with the fluid coordination of men who had trained together for months rather than the desperate improvisation that had marked earlier American attacks. "Keep your intervals," Roan called to his men as they advanced through the rice paddies toward the North Korean positions. "Watch for snipers in those trees to our left." The Marines' advance was supported by Corsair fighter bombers that screamed down from the sky to deliver napalm and rockets with pinpoint accuracy. The close coordination between ground and air forces represented a quantum leap forward from the chaotic early days of the Korean conflict, when American units often fought in isolation without adequate support. Private First Class Robert Simonek, carrying his squad's Browning automatic rifle, spotted movement in a cluster of farm buildings 400 yards ahead. His trained eye immediately identified the characteristic muzzle flash of a North Korean machine gun position. Without hesitation, he dropped to one knee and began delivering accurate suppressive fire while his squad mates maneuvered for a flanking attack. The North Korean resistance, though fierce, lacked the coordination and flexibility that had characterized their earlier operations. Weeks of continuous combat had taken their toll on enemy units. while the constant pressure of American air attacks had disrupted their supply lines and communication networks. What had once been a confident, advancing army was now a collection of isolated units fighting desperate holding actions, according to classified intelligence, assessments later declassified by the Defense Department. The North Korean People's Army had suffered catastrophic casualties during their assault on the Pusan perimeter. An estimated 60,000 enemy soldiers had been killed or wounded, representing nearly half of their effective combat strength in South Korea. By September 15th, the Marine offensive had achieved a breakthrough that transformed the entire strategic situation. North Korean forces began withdrawing across the Naktong River in disorder, abandoning equipment and supplies in their haste to escape the advancing Americans. The retreat quickly became a rout as Marine air power harassed the fleeing columns. Walker watched the situation reports flowing into his headquarters with a mixture of relief and amazement. After nearly 3 months of continuous defeat and retreat, his forces had not only held their ground, but had begun to push the enemy back. The Pusan perimeter had held, and with it, the hope of preserving South Korean independence. Captain Louis Millet, now commanding the remnants of 2 companies after the original Easy Company commander had been evacuated with wounds, led his men across the Naktong River in pursuit of the retreating North Koreans. The same ground that had been soaked with American blood just weeks earlier now witnessed the spectacle of enemy soldiers fleeing in panic. "Sir, we've secured the high ground overlooking the river," reported Sergeant First Class O'Brien, whose Irish accent had become a reassuring constant throughout the long ordeal. No sign of organized enemy resistance. Millet nodded, but his expression remained cautious. The Korean War had taught him that apparent victories could quickly turn into disasters if commanders became overconfident. Yet as he watched the stars and stripes being raised over positions that had been in enemy hands just hours earlier, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The Battle of Pusan perimeter was over. The stand that had seemed doomed to failure had instead become the foundation for ultimate victory. South Korea had been saved from total defeat by the courage and determination of men who had refused to surrender when surrender seemed the only rational option. Their sacrifice had preserved not only a nation, but also the principle that aggression would not go unchallenged in the emerging Cold War world. The road to Seoul lay open once again.